Good evening and welcome to episode 50 of the Political Mike podcast. I can't believe it's been 50 episodes, and I am so happy to have you guys on for the 50th edition. So much has happened this week. We've had two big elections take place, two gubernatorial elections specifically take place. Of course, there are other municipal elections around the country, but pretty much the consensus is that it was a big night for the GOP. We also have the ongoing trial pertaining in Kenosha, Wisconsin, pertaining to Kyle Rittenhouse. And we also have President Biden returning from a global summit pertaining to climate change. Here to help me break all of this down, in addition to the negotiations going on about the Build Back Better agenda and the bipartisan infrastructure deal, are three dynamic panelists. I've had them all before, inquisitive minds, great perspectives, and it's going to be a good discussion tonight. So I'm glad you tuned in. We have Camilla, who has been the former director of campus programs and regional political director for Doug Jones for U.S. Senate. She's a social worker, a visual artist, and a political activist from San Francisco, California. She's a graduate of Oakland University, and she has a background in social work. with field experience in medical social work, human rights advocacy, crisis services, and child welfare. She serves as an elected member of the Alabama Democratic Party's executive board and is currently working as a campaign consultant and pursuing a master's in public administration with a concentration in public policy. Camilla, it's always a treat to have you on. Thanks for being back. We also have Nate Honore, who is a 3L at Quinnipiac University School of Law. Always a treat to have Nate on. And finally, we have Ms. Tia Toombs, who is a senior at Oakwood University, who was also Miss Oakwood University, I believe, last year. Is that correct? Yeah. So really great panel. Looking forward to the discussion. But I want to start off by talking about Tuesday night. A lot of folks, especially, Republicans, have said, well, this is a bellwether of what Democrats can expect. And when you look at historically speaking, those two races, Virginia and New Jersey, both, I know a lot of folks that said Virginia, but when you look at the history of New Jersey too, going back to like the Jimmy Carter administration, both have really turned to the opposite direction whenever one party wins the White House. You go back to 2009, Chris Christie wins the governorship. Bob McDonnell wins the governorship in Virginia. Chris Christie in New Jersey. You go back to, the aftermath of 9/11, a Democrat won the state of Virginia and the state of New Jersey. You go back to the Clinton years, the same trend. So it wasn't completely a bad night for Democrats because Phil Murphy narrowly held on. But I want to get your thoughts as to whether, what went wrong and why did things go so much so in the GOP's direction in your view? And what can the Democrats learn from this?
I would like to say that one of the most common phrases I've been hearing is that McAwful, or I don't really know how to pronounce his name, McAwful was uninspiring. And I would say I have to agree. But I'd also say that the Republicans have been unusually inspiring, and the most common emotion or the most common thing that they inspire is stupidity from their voters. And just a lack of research, a lack of critical thinking, I would say, from the Republicans right now. So to counteract that, I don't think that Democrats can use the basic mode of reason right now, especially in their elections. And just McAwful, sorry, was just it was just a regular campaign to me. There wasn't really anything that would have brought me out for him if I lived in Virginia. So it wasn't that surprising that he lost, and he started to turn towards COVID-19 and focusing on that, and I think he waited a little bit too late for that because he started gaining in the polls afterwards, and it just wasn't enough. Some of the things that Virginia voters really cared about, he waited a little too late to address. So,
no, I completely agree. I think that McAuliffe, thought that, he could basically run on the same kind of, anti-Trump playbook that worked last fall. The problem is that, we're almost a year in to a new president's administration, Democratic president's administration. And the frustration with folks isn't with Trump anymore. It's really with the lack of any kind of action going on Capitol Hill. And so I think that's why you saw him on the Sunday morning talk show saying, well, you bet I'm frustrated with the Democrats. Get in there and negotiate a deal. But, to your point, Tia, I think he did focus on Trump too much. I think that, when you contrast his message with Youngkin's, and I even, had a feeling that Youngkin was going to win. You had more people who had something to vote for, regardless of whether it was based in reality. The whole critical race theory issue that wasn't even taught in Virginia public schools. They had something that attached them to Youngkin. And there was even a woman who said she voted for every Democrat in every presidential election, including President Biden. She voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But she said she was going hard for Youngkin because, he was talking about education, the fact that kids were, spending months on end at this virtual learning space, the fact that, he was talking about giving more power to parents when it come down to curriculums, and all of those things really appealed to that demographic. I want to get the rest of your thoughts.
I would have to. So Republicans, I think, are kind of right? They're saying that Democrats are sort of in out of their heads. I think it was the House Minority Leader who was talking about the election and was saying that Democrats are going after these extremists, what he considers to be extremists. I understand why they would think that they were lofty goals, considering we can't get nothing done. Like, yeah, this huge climate, whatever, we're going to do all these. And it's like, they're really all, and a lot of them are really just for show, right? They're either, representative politics or putting someone in that position to make it seem like progress, or we're talking about it, or playing off of people's, we're doing a lot of emotional manipulation. We did a lot of emotional manipulation between 2016 and 2020 to help turn out voters. But I think people are understanding that that's really not enough. People are looking for actual action, real answers to their issues. And so I think we're going to continue to see trends like this, where even if people aren't voting more Republican, I think that people are definitely losing interest, and that is just as scary.
Most definitely.
I would agree.
I think
Go ahead.
I would agree.
Sorry, Tia, go ahead.
I think that the Republicans have found themselves a long-term playbook. I don't think that it's sustainable, obviously, but right now it's working for them. They're winning elections, and we might not agree with that playbook, but it's going to solidify itself in history. Trump was the one who introduced it, and it was just wildly popular. The way that he executed his, sometimes like just stepping away from basic politics and just getting on a podium and just talking and just honestly without even any real sort of action plans. But to me, that's the basic factors of inspiration when it comes to an election, and the Republicans have that. They're inspiring people that I don't agree with, but in reality, it's actually working. Like you were saying, the Democrats are they're kind of going for the same playbook, honestly, and it's really not working. We're seeing that it's hurting them, and they've got to find a different way. Really, they do.
I think the one big lesson that Democrats need to take from this is that the consultants that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are using don't have their finger on the pulse anymore. It's been very obvious since January, since the new crop of representatives were seated and everyone got their committee assignments, that education was going to be the big thing that Republicans are going to focus on, not just for the off-year elections this year in Virginia and New Jersey, but also in next year's midterms. And a lot of things can be bundled down into education: school sports, vaccinations, school closures, COVID policy in general. You can all boil that down into education. So it's been obvious that education was going to be the wedge issue for this election. The GOP has mastered getting their base angry. So at this point, you shouldn't be surprised that the base can be angry and show up to vote, because angry people vote. So, the fact that nobody was clued in on, hey, Youngkin is going to make this all about education, really says something about the state of who the party is hiring as consultants. And really, it also is a huge question mark on Jamie Harrison's ability to lead seats, since his number one job is to win elections.
The story that's not getting a lot of attention, I think, is the fact that Black turnout was low. That's really what I think put the nail in the coffin for McCullough's candidacy. I think that, McCullough being a governor already, he was a former governor, goes going back to 2013 to 2017, I believe. He had a record. And when you have a record, you want to run on that record. You want to explain why it is that things were better, or what it is that you're going to take to the next level, right? And what it is that's at stake if the other side gets the governorship. I think that, even going into the debates, watching the two debates that took place, listening to how Youngkin was trying to position himself as, Mr. Economy, trying to make himself look like, look, I understand how businesses work. I understand how 503Cs work. I understand how the corporate world works. And Terry McAuliffe, saying, well, no, you don't. And the two of them going back and forth, and Youngkin, also kind of finger pointing and saying, I'm going to look to see how many times you mentioned the name Trump tonight. All of those things resonated with folks who actually sympathize with Trump, wish they could have had him as president, but just couldn't bear the thought of him being in charge in the cockpit with COVID still going on. If he had hammered, like Tia had mentioned, on COVID, from the jump, I think it would have been a much tighter race. And not to say that it wasn't a tight race already. I mean, look, when you look at the polls, you see that Youngkin won by a hair, really, 50.9% to 48.4%. I know a lot of folks are saying, oh, this is a landslide. I would say, well, if you think this is a landslide, then last year was a landslide for the Democrats, because, you're seeing these narrow margins. I know they took the legislature, but the fact that it was so close doesn't mean that you have the mandate you think you have, in my view. And to your point with Jimmy Harrison, that was a good point, Nate. I think Jimmy Harrison, I think, understands retail politics, being that he was from South Carolina, and he said, look, I'm running on South Carolina issues. I think the thing that hurt McAuliffe was the fact that a lot of folks wanted to rebel against the establishment. When you see Obama coming in, Stacey Abrams coming in, you had the mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, flying in. You had all these outsiders coming in to tell Virginia what to do. I do think that stirred up the wrong response from that crowd. That, coupled with the lack of Black voter enthusiasm, is what made it a done deal. Any other thoughts? Oh, well, let me ask this question. What are the key takeaways? What are the key takeaways? If Glenn Youngkin's candidacy is actually a blueprint for how the GOP is to move forward, not embracing Trump all the way, kind of moving that, middle of the line approach, appealing to the traditional, like, Romney Bush Republicans, what are the key takeaways in that approach to you on moving forward in the midterms and possibly 2024?
Democrats need to deliver on their agenda, especially for their Black voters. Black voters sat through 8 years of a Black president. We are now almost a year into having a Black vice president. That's not enough if you don't actually have a tangible benefit for the people who made it possible for you to get there in the first place. So yeah, Biden's signature legislation so far was the American Rescue Plan, but that was in February, March. We're in November now. What we were supposed to have is the infrastructure bill, and we can't even get that because a few people in the Senate think that 4 weeks of paid parental leave is too much. You need to actually pass if you want people to be decided to vote for you, especially the base of your party, which is Black, which is young, which is female. And especially, if people like Youngkin are able to kind of sew up the Romney voters, and we had this discussion earlier, I used the wrong Republican, but the Romney voters, the kind of Gerald Ford Republicans, who are the mythical people who are really more socially liberal but fiscally conservative or whatever, those people are still going to vote GOP 10 times out of 10. So that's not a block that you can actually win. You need to actually get the people who are going to vote for you to come out and show up for you.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't agree with Nathan more. I feel like Democrats are paving the way for the success of Republicans. They don't have to have a game plan because we're constantly getting in our own way. I feel like where Nathan's completely right about a lot of who these consultants are. Often their profile in terms of who they are is very white. It's older. It's generally male, and so what we're getting is not advice or perspective from the people who these bills are actually affecting. We're getting advice and perspective from people who are assuming what multiple minority groups who all have a variety of different interests might want. And then on top of that, we're trying to find this middle ground between the interests of people who are asking for very simple things like access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And in more extreme states like this, right, they're asking for healthcare in response to a global pandemic. They're asking for economic, relief after an economic crisis, and that's just what we've experienced in the last 2 years. That's not, the homelessness, the poverty, the all of the other things that have already been present, right? And so then when you are asking me to vote for you, but the middle line that you're trying to find is between my humanity and not turning off certain voters who might disagree with certain matters, which matters are they? Let me know. Tell me. Give me a list of what these matters are, right? And let me know why someone might agree with them. And then after you let me know why they might agree with them, let me know why you are in the business of negotiating with people who do not have my best interest in mind, right? Not in an attempt to protect their personal freedoms, but truly in an attempt to take the freedoms away from others. I've worked in communications. We've done a lot of work with lots of different democratic organizations across the U.S. And depending on the member, depending on the situation, depending on what's going on at the time, there are certain things that you are not really sort of allowed to talk about at the time because it might create a rift. Ooh, that's a hot button issue. Ooh, maybe we shouldn't talk about that. Why not? And for the people who those issues are affecting, for how long are we going to ask them to wait and then blame the black vote, blame the lack of turnout on the black vote? The black vote? Are you serious? It feels like projection. It feels like misplaced blame to me. That's all I'm going to say.
No, those are solid points, and this is the fact that the campaign did not focus more on what is critical race theory. There's a lot of misconceptions about it. I know a lot of people have said, "Oh, well, it's not taught in public school." Michael Steele, it's not taught in Virginia public school. Your sixth grader is not learning critical race theory. What is critical race theory? Let's learn what it is, right? Because these same folks would say, "Well, we already learned about slavery." But how can you learn about slavery and not know, okay, why is there a graduation gap today in 2021? Why is there an income gap today in 2021? The story didn't end, in the Reconstruction era. There was something that happened that caused these things. They didn't fall out the sky. Let me just pause and say, all the views and perspectives represented tonight are our own and are not reflective of anyone else. But that being said, I'm curious to know, in addition to Camilla's point, is low black voter turnout to blame for McCullough's defeat? When I when I was looking at an article, Marsha Price, who's a member of the Virginia House of Delegates who won re-election, one of the successful Democrats this past Tuesday, said, "I believe that black voters are easily the first target for when things don't go for how they want it to go." She said, "It's a trash take to look at us and not the middle." She said, "The middle said Youngkin is more palatable than Trump, and they were willing to take a chance with him." What is your response to that kind of take?
I was gonna say the exact or something similar. I hate using this word, but it feels like gaslighting, where these candidates continue to ignore Black issues that, my community, the Black community, really honestly and truly care about, that affect us every day, that affect our human rights violations every single day. They continue to ignore us. And then go and win or lose their elections and try to blame us for the outcome of that. And as you were saying, there's so many factors as to why someone could lose an election. But I feel if you lost an election because of lack of Black voter turnout, it's no one's fault but your own. Because you can't continue to ignore a set of people and then blame them for your loss, because you deserved that loss. You're a representative and you're supposed to represent every person in that district, in that zone. And I say, go ahead, blame us if that's the case, but don't gaslight us or try to make us feel bad because we didn't elect a Democrat in office, because that Democrat wasn't listening. And that's the voice, that's the answer. Our answer to you was no, because you didn't listen. So sure, I personally don't think that our lack of turnout was to blame. I think Olive had various reasons why, and I've mentioned a few of them before. But yeah, I'm really sick of that defense.
And to that point as well, the thing is, when you look at the map, when you look at Loudoun County, when you look at Fairfax, when you look at Roanoke, when you look at the map side by side with the 2020 regime, election map that the counties Biden and Trump won, the blue areas really went blue and the red areas went red. What was interesting was the margins in which those counties were won. You look at Alexandria, you're looking at Albemarle. You go down to the Richmond area, Chesterfield County, Chesapeake City. Those areas went for McCullough solidly. And everything else, the huge swaths of red, where there's a lot of land but not much people, those went for Youngkin. But Youngkin was able to motivate folks to get to the polls, and folks had a reason. You talked about the grocery tax, that resonates with folks. Oh, I can understand that. I'm going to benefit from that tangibly. When you talk about, in addition to the education issue, it was so interesting to see how he decided what the election was going to be about, and then went ahead and just hammered that in. And then when McCall slipped up, and it was like a throwaway line, he said, parents shouldn't tell teachers what to teach. People pounced on that. Now, when you break that apart, it's like, in the same way parents shouldn't tell doctors how to prescribe medicine, or parents shouldn't, give, legal advice for someone who's a defendant. It kind of makes sense that if you're in a profession, you have a special skill set that makes you understand what's needed in this situation. If he had explained that more, and allowing the other side to just spin the story, just seems to be the common theme when you're looking at these midterm elections and year after year. But the big night, the big story of the night to me was just how much of a squeaker New Jersey was. I know a lot of people were like, I knew Phil Murphy was going to win, but I didn't think it was going to be that close. And the race kind of just closed in really quickly with Jack Ciarelli closing in. I want to get your response real quick before we move on from this topic on the New Jersey race. And, if possible, if you want to talk about any of the municipal elections that took place. Boston elected its first female mayor of color, Michelle Wu, who's not even from Boston, from Illinois, which is interesting. You have the first Asian American, the first Asian American to be the mayor of Chicago, I believe. You had a lot of firsts. So it wasn't a complete loss for Democrats. You had some historic victories. What do you guys say?
New Jersey definitely was a surprise to me. New Jersey is a state that's significantly more blue than Virginia is. So for the governor's race there to come down to 2 points is a big shock. And Phil Murphy actually is quite popular there too. So it does speak to, I guess, how the national for Democrats has shifted so completely in just a year. Very glad about Boston's mayoral result. I have family who worked on the incoming Mayor Wu's campaign. As far as her appeal, it's about picking the right people. She was previously a city council member. She's a close friend of Elizabeth Warren, so she knew the right people, but she had the community connection. She campaigned on bold, ambitious proposals like rent control in Boston, which is a city that desperately needs rent control, as rent in the Northeast has been soaring lately. She campaigned on making public transit free, which is a huge deal for Boston. So, making these big ambitious proposals. And she also did something that you don't always see in Boston mayoral elections, which is that she did her best to appeal to every single community. Usually you see Boston politicians try to pit the Irish and the Italians against the Cape Verdeans, against the Haitians, against the Puerto Ricans, and pit everyone else against the Chinese. But what she did was try to bring everyone together. That's not something you especially see in Boston politics, but it's something that she said, this is what's going to work, actually getting people to come out and show up. So that's the formula that Democrats need to find and follow nationwide. Otherwise, we're in for a 2010 level beatdown at the midterms next year.
Yeah, I think we also need to, as Democrats, understand that we don't own the black vote. Nobody owes us anything. We're not. Nobody's required to. There's so much. I want us to demystify the concept of the black vote and where they are. It's yeah. It's like so many years of ownership, and now you own my vote too. Like, Jesus Christ. Like, when do we find freedom? But yeah, that's all I had to say. I just wanted to piggyback off of Tia.
Yeah, in New Jersey, Democrats benefited from the unpopularity, similar to how McAuliffe benefited, and Ralph Northam, the current governor, lame duck governor, benefited from the unpopularity of former President Trump, former Governor Chris Christie. They were able to turn once solid GOP suburbs blue. They saw their voter registration advantage over Republicans soar to more than 1 million. And they grew their state legislative majorities. When you look at the fact that they flew in Bernie Sanders, to me, that was just a show of even more confidence that, look, we've got this in the bag. We're not afraid of scaring away these middle of the road folks who are so shaky. And, let's fly Bernie in, get him to endorse Phil Murphy. Let's just wrap this thing up, get some star power in here, wrap up the base, energize folks, get enthusiasm. And I think the big shock was just how many of these suburbs who went for Trump and Christie and then went for Biden and went for Northam in 2017. I mean, not Northam, Phil Murphy in 2017. We're just like, put the brakes on a little bit. We're not completely sold with the Democratic Party because of XYZ. I know Frank Civarelli said, look, if taxes is your number one issue, New Jersey's not your state. And, these candidates kind of position themselves as Mr. Economy all the time. And it kills me how, poll after poll shows that more people have confidence in them when it comes down to the economy. Any more thoughts before we transition to the negotiation talks? Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to mention Bernie Sanders coming out. It was a lot of confidence for them to do that. I mean, he does carry a big name, but I'd like to say, in my opinion, that America is letting progressivism becoming a lot more popular, and Democrats are scared to showcase that and showcase a lot of these more liberal policies. But to me, the polls and are showing that it's wildly popular. Biden's infrastructure plan, everyone knows how popular this is. And that's why we're so frustrated that it's being gridlocked in the Senate right now. Because we know that all walks of life approve this. Right now, the pandemic, everyone is hurting. And so people who may have always voted red or may have always had one mindset are willing to try something new right now because of just how much we're going through. And so seeing seeing surprising outcome election like that, it's really letting you know to just let go of the middle ground, let go of straddling the line, because it can really pay off in a big way. Yeah.
So we also have, all these elections happening with the backdrop of, these ongoing negotiations that have been going on since last spring. For months, the House of Representatives and Senate Democrats have tried to negotiate with Senators Manchin and Sinema on a single social spending bill that could pass both chambers with as little drama as possible. Manchin and Sinema are signaling they're comfortable with the top line coming down to 1.75 trillion from 3.5 trillion. With Sinema even reassuring fellow Democrats that she's actually largely on board with the policies proposed by Biden. So that seems to be good news. But you also have that, with the multiple policy disputes remaining, House Democratic leaders and progressives are now ready to speed toward passage of a bill that doesn't have Senator Manchin's blessing. And this would make the bill face an uncertain fate in the Senate. I'm wondering if, in your view, the Democrats, have made enough concessions. Enough is enough. We've seen what happens when we don't deliver. Let's just move forward. And, we've made enough concessions to Manchin. If he's not on board now, then, forget it. We'll just move on with this process. Do you think that moving forward with this process and having an uncertain fate in the Senate is the way to go for Democrats?
I think Democrats have made too many concessions, if we're being completely honest with you. This bill started out at $3.5 trillion, and it got cut in half. The bipartisan bill that passed the Senate and only needs a House vote and Joe Biden's signature to become law is about 30% of what Joe Biden originally proposed when he first unveiled the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan back in March. And it's not even a good 30%, When you want to make this bill, this big transformative legislation that's supposed to transform the fate and the future of the country, you need to spend money. That's just the fact of the matter. I don't know why Democrats even now are still so afraid to be accused of not caring about the deficit or the national debt when Republicans don't care about the national debt either, So no one actually cares about the debt. They care about what you can tangibly do for them. So, when people see that, paid family leave is getting cut, that Joe Manchin refused to spend money on expanding the child tax credit, but he wants to spend more money to means test it anyway. When people see that two people in the majority party are allowed to block it, and nobody in party leadership is actually willing to publicly call them out and instead handles them behind closed doors with kid gloves, there's no way Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, for example, the two most moderate senators on the Republican side, would be allowed to block their party's goals like this, to the point where it wasn't until, a lot of the no's that Murkowski and Collins voted on were only after it was certain that Republicans had the votes to pass if they were going to pass. If for example, last year when Justice Barrett was confirmed, I don't believe that Susan Collins would have been allowed to vote no if Mitch McConnell was seriously worried that he didn't have the votes to pass. But since he knew he had the votes, she was allowed to make this big speech about how she was going to vote no because she didn't think it was appropriate to, nominate a justice at the time. And that probably saved her Senate career because she was reelected, and now we're stuck with her till 2026. So, speeding the bill and letting it fail isn't going to help either. But we've already, lost a bunch of momentum by just having all this infighting because the moderates want to do one thing, and the progressives are like, we have to pass the actual popular version of the bill.
No, that's a good point. And in addition to that, I'm wondering if, for instance, you have a lot of folks saying, okay, let me go back to Manchin. Manchin says, look, what's the rush? Let's have everything accounted for. Let's make sure that the price tag is in order. Let's make sure everything has a line out. Let's make sure that everything could be paid for, right? This is the same Manchin who also voted against increasing taxes on billionaires, even though there's 700 billionaires in the United States. Not one of them is in West Virginia. In addition to that, while he's saying, what's the rush? Let's just keep it going. Let's keep the negotiations going until kingdom come. We're getting closer and closer to a time when folks are not going to be focused on passing legislation at all, or at least making it a number one priority. It's all going to be about re-election, right? And if you are focused on passing legislation, they're not going to be monumental pieces of legislation here. So the window for Democrats right now is very small, right? So even with the Affordable Care Act, when we had 57 senators in the Senate, right, we still were able to move in such a way where by the time 2010 comes, spring of 2010 comes, all of the heavy lifting was already taken care of, right? And there were no senators that were willing to derail and the whole process. And to your point, Nate, if we're going to compare this to the Trump's Senate in 2017, I mean, look at how much in lockstep they were all for that 2017 jobs cut and tax cut for the rich. They were all moving in one accord. Not one Republican, no matter how moderate or reasonable, they brand themselves to be, stood in the way of that. And you still had people walking away with the badge of moderate and with the badge of far right. And so it's like we're the only ones worried about garnering support from the other side. Manchin, he's saying, well, let's make sure that this process is one in which the other side is being a part of. The other side is not even trying to play the game, folks. I mean, look, they've already made up in their mind this is something they're going to oppose. And there comes a time when you have to say, okay, I know this may cost me politically, but in the long run, this is what's going to be beneficial for the country. Any other thoughts?
Joe Manchin is either really, really gullible or this is all performance art. I'm sorry, I just have to add that in there because, for the reconciliation process to start in the first place and for the bill to start at $3.5 trillion, he had to sign on to that. So he's either really, really gullible about Republicans' willingness to operate in good faith, or this is performance art and he's trying to see how much power he actually has within the party. Because it's clear the Democratic Party is an old white man named Joe. The question is it Joe Manchin or is it Joe Biden?
And, Manchin said on MSNBC, Democrats should slow down on the social spending bill and wait and see if inflation is transitory. Senator Gillibrand of New York signaled as well in an interview that, her negotiations with Manchin on paid leave are now done. They're not done. There's still an open door. Is there still hope for paid family leave to be included in your view? Or, is Manchin's humming and hawing, and dragging his feet, just making this even more and more evident to be a lost cause in your view?
There better be paid family leave, is what I have to say. All the jobs that the bipartisan bill creates are nothing if people can't afford to actually pay for someone to look after their kids or pay for their kids to actually be in preschool. So, we're not going to actually see the benefits of the bipartisan bill unless we get the reconciliation bill. And paid family leave makes an incredible amount of sense. The US is probably the only developed country in the world that doesn't have some form of it. And 4 weeks and 12 weeks, which is, the top of the proposal, is still nothing when you look at other countries that have 36 weeks of paid family leave. Or on the lower end of those countries is 24 weeks. And we can't even agree on 4.
I mean, honestly, it feels like we can't agree on anything. Because paid family leave isn't the only thing that we're behind on at this point, and people like Joe Manchin just don't seem to care about that. It's embarrassing just how behind we are on basic things that are seen as progressive here, where across the pond it's pretty normal policy. I can't get into the mind of Manchin on whether he is just, making some power plays, trying to test his waters, his limits. But I know that it's extremely annoying as a constituent. Well, I'm not his constituent, but it's extremely annoying to see something that could help everyone, that could solve a lot of problems for a lot of different people, being stalled like this, especially the election coming up. It's not even just hurting Joe Biden, it's hurting a lot of the other senators when their elections are coming up. We need to get this passed. I mean, I can't tell you how important it is. Everyone knows, but yeah, I think recently the new, I don't know if it's strategy, but the new strategy of pitting Manchin and Sinema against each other seems to be working a little, because I guess without them together, like the united front, no one wants to be seen as the one that's stalling this popular plan, and pitting them against each other, they want to seem cooperative even if they're not. And so having this new strategy I'm not sure if it works, but I would have done it a long time ago. Honestly, I wouldn't have even pit them against each other. I would have had them I would have just put it to a vote and have them say, see, these are the two that are standing in the way of progress. These are the two. Just putting a spotlight on them. It should have been done a long time ago. I don't know what leadership is afraid of for calling them out, but it should have been done a long time ago.
So what
And
do you say? Oh, go ahead, Camille.
I was just going to add really quickly. It should have been done a long time ago, and I think that going back to the question of like, who are we asking to wait, and for how long? Again, are we asking them to wait? And there was something else that you said. Oh yeah, Joe Manchin by no means is the Democrat that we should be aligning ourselves with in terms of how the direction that we should be going. Because like Tina said, the profile for what a Democrat looks like, if you especially if you're like working on the field, working in the community, it's very common that the range in terms of like people's actual political ideals can range to be very very leftist, even in terms of these southern states that maybe majority Republican. It is not it's very common to find somebody who's like, I believe to an XYZ, but we can't talk about that right now. We're trying to the ends justifies the means, right? We're trying to look at play the long game, the end goal. But I don't think it's a good strategy. I think we're gonna continue to lose every time. And even the way that we talk about a lot of these elections that we lost, we're like, we didn't fully lose. Even that mindset is a loser mindset. It's a participation trophy. Like, oh, we lost.
Personally, if I was Chuck Schumer, I would have put Manchin and Sinema on agriculture and been on the agriculture committee and been done with that, because they don't farm in Arizona and they don't farm in West Virginia. Take away their ability to help their constituents and see how quickly they fall in line. Actually play hardball when you're a leader, because leaders need to lead. So when you're not actually publicly calling out your leaders, you know what Trump would do whenever a Republican would get a little too noisy? He'd tweet about endorsing their primary opponent, and then they'd fall back in line. Literally, because Jeff Sessions was not loyal enough to Trump, Trump ended his political career. A 30-year Senate career done just like that because he wasn't loyal enough. So now he lost his Senate seat to a football coach from Auburn, not even university, not even Nick Saban, the coach of Auburn. So, really this is about whether or not leadership is willing to fight the tough fights. And so far they've said that they haven't. And it's part of the generational difference, and when I say generation, I don't necessarily say age, but the age of your ideas and whether or not you're willing to try new things. Because Durbin and Schumer are around the same age. They've been in the party for a while, but because the Democrats are so obsessed with old ideas about seniority and prestige, Dick Durbin has been in the Senate since the mid '90s, and he's only just now becoming a committee chair, because Dianne Feinstein was running the Democratic side of the Judiciary Committee for so long. And in doing so, it meant that he pushed another Democrat out of the way who was in Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who was a much stronger questioner, especially in his passion to rid the judiciary of dark money. So, when Democrats focus on doing things the way they've always been done, it means that they're cutting themselves short and robbing themselves of future opportunities. Chuck Grassley literally stepped down from judiciary because it meant that giving Lindsey Graham, who was a big national figure in the party, that extra microphone. Democrats need to learn to do the same thing.
Now, what do you guys say to those Republican voters or Republican-leaning voters who say, look, we didn't vote for Biden because we want social infrastructure. All of this is throwing money away to folks who are not trying to work and get a job and get a living. And I've paid my way. I put my kid through college. I put myself through, an education. And, if I can do it, then other folks can do it. And, we voted for him to handle COVID-19. We voted for him. Yeah, we'll do infrastructure. We do need to upgrade our airports and our roads and bridges. But this is not what I voted for. I didn't vote for an FDR-style presidency. I'm looking for more of a nice, calm, moderate Democrat, because that's what I was willing to vote for against Trump. What do you say to those folks?
Well, Republicans didn't vote for Biden in the first place. Trump got like 97% of the Republican vote, meaning the places where Republicans actually flipped the election to Biden were minimal at best. Georgia was led by grassroots activists. Arizona was the perfect coalition of grassroots activists, Trump's unpopularity in the Navajo Nation, who watched the GOP's response to COVID-19 decimate their own communities and say, no more, enough is enough. So GOP voters don't want Democrats to win. Democrats are too obsessed with trying to please those voters instead of their own base. And part of it is just the fact that they're not willing to talk and actually get in front of microwaves and get in front of cameras and dominate the airwaves. They don't act. The GOP is allowed to dictate the terms of debate because the GOP always speaks first and floods the airwaves until they find something that sticks. Meanwhile, the consultants for the Democratic side are trying to find the perfect focus tested words that's going to appease not only the progressives, but also the moderates, the suburban swing voters, and of course the Romney type Republicans who are all about compromise and bipartisanship. But, in words anyway, but not actually in action.
I would say the type of voter you're talking about lacks basic empathy for the everyday American. I'm not sure who that would be, but whatever old money Republican that you were referring to, I would say your generational wealth has helped you, and that's fine. But there's plenty of people out there that are struggling, and this plan can help the everyday person. And to just dig deep and find some empathy for that, you might not want to spend money, but there has been plenty of proposals on how to pay for this through billionaires tax and other taxes that they might not like. And as Nathan was saying, the GOP didn't vote for Biden, but even if he is an FDR president, history stands positive on that worked for the plans that FDR put in place really worked at a time when people were hurting, and it created jobs, and it created a lot of money flowing through the economy. So
and Social Security.
Yes. So, and these historic policies that we didn't think would ever be normal in our society are now, essential to our way of life. So it might seem very progressive right now, but just give it a try. And when the next time a Republican president gets elected, he can just dismantle it.
So I do want to move on to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial that's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This past Tuesday, jurors had starkly different portrayals about Kyle Rittenhouse. Of course, Kyle Rittenhouse was the 17-year-old who was charged. Now he's 18, who was charged with killing 2 men and wounding a third during the summer of 2020 during the George Floyd protests. And he killed them with an assault-style rifle. And so, the trial is going on. The prosecutor said that Rittenhouse set the bloodshed in motion when he triggered a confrontation with a man that night that killed him, then killed him with a bullet in the back. Rittenhouse's attorney told the jury that his client acted in self-defense after the man tried to grab Rittenhouse's gun. And others kicked the teen in the face and clubbed him in the head with a skateboard. He said, "You as jurors will end up looking at it from the standpoint of a 17-year-old under the circumstances as they existed." And of course, the defense attorney's name is Mark Richards. I want to get your perspective of that defense attorney's, what seems to be the crux of his argument, in that not only was it self-defense, but please place yourself in the mind of this child. I know, Nate, from torts, when we talk about the reasonable person, that language has so many meanings in different contexts. But when we're talking about, at least with torts, especially with minors, a lot of times the jury instruction would be put yourself in the reasonable child of that similar age in their position. Is that jury instruction correct in your view? Anyone can jump in.
I think it's premature. we haven't had the whole trial yet. We're not actually at the phase where the jury needs to sit down and deliberate. We're still in the early, opening phases of it. So whether or not it's correct isn't the right question. I think whether or not the question itself is actually right is the proper question. We all have our own feelings on Kyle Rittenhouse, mainly that he had no business in Wisconsin anyway because he doesn't live in that state. But, that's not what, we're here to litigate. His defensive team is playing the kind of strategy that he was, a good, upright, all-American who just found himself as a victim of the circumstances. But the fact of the matter is that this is a kid who crossed state lines to the gun he wasn't legally allowed to own, and, with the intent to shoot people down, because his goal was to defend the mom and pop stores of Kenosha, Wisconsin. He was working with, police as a militia, as, a member of a local militia, and not, he wasn't defending his own property. He was defending the stores for people he never met on behalf of local police. So, that actually needs to be played out before the jury in its whole, state before we can talk about jury instructions. I think the attorney did a really smart thing by planting it in the minds of the jury already. But, I think it's a premature question to make.
And what's also interesting is that the defense attorney said, look, Kyle Rittenhouse did have ties to Kenosha, Wisconsin. He it wasn't like he was a stranger coming out of anywhere. He traveled to Kenosha from his home in Illinois, just across the Wisconsin state line. He went there to protect property. He, had some kind of connection in terms of proximity to the location. So let's not make it seem like he's someone who just came from a random state and came over here. What do you guys make of that argument?
I personally think that this whole trial is egregious already. I just think it's a disgrace to our justice system. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the defense attorney has said the N-word multiple times already. That the jury has a disproportionate amount of white people, and just the whole premise of the crime it's just outrageous to me, especially if I'm going to put myself in the shoes of a teenager of that age, 17. Put myself in his shoes. I remember 17 very well, and I can't remember ever seeing myself do something like that. And I will say that's just me. I consider myself to be somewhat radical. I've been to a protest or two in my day. Never have I had the desire to be violent or, to bring guns to an already hostile situation. So I realized that, there are people that are very different from me, but to have to put myself in that kind of shoe isn't something that I want to do. And this trial it doesn't seem like a reasonable outcome can be made already. I'm not sure if there's grounds for a mistrial. I'm not a legal expert yet, but it's just hard to watch this all play out already, seeing the mistakes the missteps that are being taken.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, it's also just pretty scary, and it's reflective of just kind of like the entire system that we're under. They're trying really hard to paint this situation as, some young kid who headed over to Wisconsin to visit his grandma and pick up candy. It's not that. Mm-hmm. You went across state lines, right, to an event with a group of people whose ideals don't align with yours, and then decided to bring weaponry. So that's where we're starting, right? And it's also scary to me that a minor can join a militia that would work alongside the police. And I think it's alarming that a militia who is involved in murdering multiple people or murdering 2 people, injuring 1 at a protest is also who came in collaboration with the police. And I think that's very scary. I think that is absolutely terrifying. And I think that when people see things like that, right? Because he also had a lot of there were a lot of like symbols, flags, things like that he aligned himself with, also to key us in on where his personal ideals were, the perspective that he might be coming from. And I think that it's scary that individuals with that align themselves really with white supremacy in that way, so heavily and so deeply, would then find buddies within a department that is here to allegedly protect and serve. And I think the response is also scary, because we know, I mean, it's the same story over and over again, right? We saw it in the responses to Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C. versus the response to January 6th. It feels like a very clear statement, and a very you are outlining who the enemy is, and letting us know who you align with. And so for how long too, again, do I have to wait for any sort of progress around that, or trust that they are really there for me, for my protection, for my safety, if every time I see you're buddy with the white supremacists? I don't know. It's very tough. I mean, I know this, it may be tough using those words in relation to this person while he's on trial. I'm sure that they're trying to stay away from things like that. But also, we're also talking about a literal murderer, so it's very tough. It's very, very tough. Yeah.
I would also say, on top of that, I believe they're not allowed to refer to the victims as actual victims. And Camilla's right; it's very scary. I mean, I've always known what kind of system that we've had. As a Black woman, it's clear how much we had to protest for somebody like George Floyd, and seeing, justice just being so blatantly pushed aside right now. It's not just scary. It's typical, is what it is. I wish I could say that I'm surprised, but it's America.
The elements of first degree murder just seem to be just as clear and cut as they are. You're talking about killing a person with intent, deliberation, and premeditation. When you look at the facts and you see the fact that the guy he shot had his back turned, how do you make the argument that that's self-defense if his back is turned? This is making me feel.
They make that argument every time we shoot an unarmed Black person as police officers. It's the same thing. They're like, we know. Oh yeah, his back was to you. We know.
And while this gets, you listen to Janine Shapiro on Fox, and he was a little boy who was concerned about his community. He thought he needed to take upon himself. You listen to Tucker Carlson praising him, and then you go back to 2012. Trayvon Martin was a man. Trayvon Martin was, someone a grown man who was up to no good. And thank God we had George Zimmerman there to be the community watchman of the year. The fact that folks are willing to spin these narratives without being given a script, without having to convene and come up with an idea of what we're going to say all together, to me is amazing. Because here, for folks who pride themselves of being textualists, a lot of these conservatives pride themselves in being people of the text. Don't talk to me about the spirit of the law. Tell me what the text says. The text says, if you have premeditation, the fact that he traveled there, right? The fact that he made the trip, the fact that he packed his gun with him, he's not. What else would he be bringing the gun for? Deliberation, deliberate intent seems to also be there. And you just go down the list, you just see element after element, and it's just interesting to see folks twist themselves into knots and make this controversial. This is not controversial. This is as clear as day. Take Trayvon Martin and put him in a Virginia suburb and, get the same result. And then all of a sudden these folks would fall in alignment with, the prosecutor. But before we end tonight, I do want to get your thoughts on President Biden's trip to Glasgow. I know we have about a minute left in the show, but this was a big deal because you're talking about President Biden actually making an apology on behalf of his predecessor for the United States leaving the Paris Climate Accords. Of course, Secretary of State John Kerry, now the climate envoy, President Obama, worked tirelessly to get the United States to get into that agreement. Trump, of course, took us out like he did the Iran nuclear deal. And so now the United States is viewed with some skepticism, with Trump waiting seemingly in the wings for 2024. Can we trust the United States to make long-term commitments when it comes down to CO2 emissions, when it comes down to, imposing taxes on certain polluters? How did Biden's message of not just apologizing for coming out of the Paris Climate Accords, but also his optimism in terms of what can be done by the year 2030 in terms of climate reductions being lower than it's ever been since 2005. What did you make of that? Do you think that those were realistic, tangible goals, or do you think that the United States, can't be trusted anymore when it comes down to climate policy?
I'm gonna say it doesn't matter if they're realistic or not. They're gonna have to be. We don't have much time. We don't really have a choice. So I am pretty happy with Biden's trip to Glasgow and some of the promises he made. I'll say, even if those promises are broken, any sort of effort to me is a win in my book. Hopefully, any president that comes after Biden can uphold those same promises, because our generation really can see the importance of climate change, and we are running out of time, really. So I would appreciate any sort of promise and any sort of attempt to be made, but that's just me.
His climate optimism and his climate ambitions is definitely welcome. It's definitely helpful. But if he wants to actually lead as the US, then he needs to actually be willing to fight the tough fights, both domestically and abroad, when it comes time to make negotiations for more, when it comes to making negotiations for other international agreements that deal with climate, or even with trade agreements, because the consensus among the Democratic Party is that the US will not enter into trade agreements without significant concessions for labor and climate. So both in his foreign policy agenda and in his at-home agenda, Biden needs to be willing to fight the tough fights. And the big question, 9-10 months now into his administration, is whether or not he's willing to fight them, because so far it looks like he's not. So unless he actually gets involved and is willing to get his hands dirty, instead of being the president who's above the fray, but being the president who's in the fight, then we're not actually going to see his goals come to pass.
Sure. I think I'm going to say too, he's definitely going to have to piss off some Republicans. He's going to have to piss off big coal, the oil industry. That's just what's going to need to happen. And so far we've seen him kind of step away from that. But I hope, like you said, the big fights, you got to be in them.
And what was notable about this summit was actually who was not at the summit. President Xi Jinping of China. China, of course, one of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters. President Xi Jinping didn't even bother to attend the Glasgow climate conference, and he won't be joined. He didn't join by video either. Biden chastised China as well as Russia in a press conference at the end of the G20 meeting, saying the countries basically didn't show up in terms of any commitments to deal with climate change. But the Biden administration and European governments have been triangulating their climate strategy in hopes to kind of push China along to, in alignment with, the G20's goals of zero carbon emissions by mid-century 2050. Did President Biden do an effective job, in terms of diplomacy and increasing the pressure on China and Russia?
I think we're seeing the traditional East-West alignments, the traditional US, France, UK versus Eastern Europe and Russia alignment. But the fact of the matter is that, it comes down to domestic policy as well. China and Russia are able to do whatever they want climate-wise because they sell so much coal and gas, respectively, to the rest of their regions. Eastern Europe runs on Russian natural gas. East Asia runs on Chinese coal. So unless you and your allies can come together and find a way to get the rest of the world off of coal and gas, then, save the rhetoric, because that's all it is at the end of the day, just hot air.
Yeah. Tia mentioned how we'd be angering a lot of Republicans, but we'd also be angering a lot of people who are benefiting financially from oil and gas, from all of these companies, these companies who are continuing to produce plastic, even though we know that recycling essentially has been a proven myth now, and so is he going to be able to stand up to the people on both sides? Because it's not a part money speaks to both parties, right? Is he going to be able to stand up in that way? And then I'm also really interested in it is the typical sort of alignments, but I'm interested in knowing outside of economically what China's reasoning would be, because I was reading about how they're working a lot on their reforestation. They're working a lot on the implementation of solar and all these sort of things that would imply that they're in alignment with ensuring that we're doing something about climate change. So to not show up, I think, is an interesting statement that I don't think is done by accident by any means.
And yeah, I think the East, and along with America, we are the ones dragging our feet because we stand the most to gain from destroying the planet. Gas and coal and other non-productive energy sources. It really, like you were saying, it's how money makes the world go round. And if we can prove that green energy has money and can funnel into the economy, I think maybe they'd be more open to it. But right now, who's going to pay the bills? Right now, that's gas and coal. So.
And it's very interesting because we talked about the importance of domestic policy in decisions like this too, because I think especially in terms of gaining the not the support but the faith of American citizens, global citizens, really in the idea that we would really be able to enact real climate change that would make an impact, that could reverse things, that could provide our children's children a future. It's I would imagine it would be hard to believe in policy that strong, or to believe that their desire for us to stay alive and live well would be any sort of motivation when being compared to the much greater motivation of financial gain for the wealthy few, right? And so when you again don't provide healthcare to millions of people during a global health crisis, you don't provide people economic, any sort of economic relief. You pull back on student debt. You're cutting funding significantly on your big infrastructure plan. It's hard to believe when real life people's lives are at stake, even with those policies, that then with something this large that I could appeal to your humanity really enough to see me as a valuable enough life to make the right decisions over profit. Yeah.
And what's interesting? Like Tia said, as we're dragging our feet on climate change and whether or not this is worth, investing in, Germany's election last month, the number one issue was climate change. The center-left Social Democrats actually are on track for 26.0% of the vote, ahead of 24.5% for Merkel's Christian Democratic conservative bloc. And the number one issue, according to NPR News, for a lot of the German voters was who's going to address the climate change crisis the best. And it just goes to show you how, drastically far ahead the rest of the world is in addressing climate change than the United States. But I do want to thank you panelists. I know that time has come to an end. Camilla Ahmed, Nate Honore, Tia Toombs, it's always a pleasure and honor to have you on this program. Thank you for what you brought to episode 50. This was, 50 episodes. I honestly didn't anticipate it to get this long, but I thank you for what you've done to make this conversation one of substance and very insightful. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 50 of the Political Mic podcast. Thanks for tuning in.